Hello everyone, this is episode 3 of Intersections Mission to Innovate. I'm Gracie Davidson and with me is Kuan and Prachi Sutanka here at the Spark Studio. In this episode, Kuan and Prachi will be discussing about intersections between a culture of innovation and mindfulness. To create a seamless and connected innovation ecosystem, trust is a critical factor for all organizations and its members. In order to achieve high-quality collaboration and ultimately a culture of innovation, Kuan and Prachi will discuss mindfulness at both a cognitive and biological level and share some practical and actionable ways to bring mindfulness to work. So let's get rolling. Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of Intersections Mission to Innovate. I'm with Kuan and Prachi. I'm so excited. I'm going to kick it off to you, Kuan. I know we have a lot to cover. Let's get started.
Thanks, Gracie. I can't believe we're at episode 3. Thank you to you, Prachi, for working with me on this project. It's been a great gift of the year. All right, so let's cover a little bit of what we've done so far in episode 1 and 2. We covered the ingredients of collaboration, the different organizational structures, both from an intra and then inter-organizational collaboration perspective. We covered topics like culture, different facets, including managing chaos. And then in the context of that chaos, it's led us to start thinking about this idea of mindfulness and the idea that at an individual level, as well as an organizational level, leads us to a better culture and better capabilities in terms of managing this idea of innovation, which is what we care about here. So we've talked about culture as a key ingredient to do collaboration and ultimately innovation in episode 1 and 2. Prachi, what are the different facets of a culture of innovation that are conducive to innovation?
Hey, Kuan, so glad to be back chatting with you here. And I have to say that today's conversation could end up being one of my favorite ones. I just have a hunch about it. All right. So back to your question, I think there are 3 pillars when we start decomposing this culture. So the first is culture that allows for curiosity, right? Where people are willing to ask questions, where we are willing to learn and experiment. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think, is a culture that promotes diversity. And we've talked about this quite a bit, where we talk about cross-disciplinary approaches. And along with that, I also think that there is diversity of thought, right? That essentially allows you to connect the dots across different ideas, different disciplines. And I mean, that's like the classic definition of innovation. It's pretty much, what we talk about when we talk about intersections, the concept. So I think that's number 2. And finally, I think there is, number 3 is an element of camaraderie, where there is a level of sharing and trust. And then that makes for a safe environment. It brings a certain transparency into the communication. And it essentially allows to manage this seemingly chaotic process of innovation, right? So I think it is that third pillar where we talk about managing chaos and sharing and trust is where we start connecting it with mindfulness. And as we talk about culture of innovation and mindfulness, I think maybe we want to start by defining what we mean by mindfulness, right? At least for the purpose of our today's conversation. Mm-hmm. So Kuan, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I love the way you constructed that. And then ending with this idea of that camaraderie and that trust that you want. Mm-hmm. And the more I've read about, innovation and research, the types of cultures that really allow for this collaboration to thrive, that trust is instrumental, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't work without that. The way I want to think about mindfulness today is through the readings that I've done by Pema Chodron. Mm-hmm. So she's a monk that has done extensive writing to help the Western culture understand Buddhism and mindfulness. And her 3 methods for managing chaos, as she calls it, is first to do no harm. And from that, the idea of not struggling with whatever the challenge is, right? And refraining from doing the same old thing. So I want us to come back to that point. The second step is to take what she calls as poison, or what I would like to call here failure, as medicine. And the idea here is that whatever is happening, there's purpose for that, regardless of whether it's a good or bad event. And then the final thing is the idea that the path is the goal. So as I transition from those 3 steps to then, sort of bring it back to our topic of innovation, when we think about the methodologies associated with innovation, we talk about starting where you are, right? So I sort of associate that with the do no harm, right? Our step one, understand where we are starting from, because we don't want so much disruption that we cause something to break in a bad way. And then refraining from thinking about the problem in the same usual way, right? My favorite quote is, the most dangerous phrase in the language is, we've always done it this way, right? So we have this tendency to always go back to old ways of doing things. And that's where innovation sort of dies a little bit, right? We need to constantly question our methods and how we do things. The second step, so where she said take poison as medicine, when we think about failing fast, right? Failure is absolutely acceptable in this context. And when we think about innovation, because we learn from it. But the idea here is to fail in a planned and constructive way. So understanding that an experiment could fail, but now we have to pivot to the next thing and have mechanisms to do that. And then finally, the path is the goal. The idea that as we introduce these methodologies and change our processes, change our way of doing things, the culture and that new way of doing things is the goal. Because through that, right, we have more innovative organizations, more innovative individuals and employees in our organization. And that's what we ultimately want. It's not about the new technology that we're bringing, even though that's really cool and exciting. It's more about the culture that we're creating. So having said that, Prachi, tell me your definition of mindfulness, because I think we all come at it from different perspectives.
Absolutely, would love to. And before I do that, Kuan, I have to say that this whole drawing the parallels between the culture of innovation and mindfulness principles, I think that exercise alone, I have to say, is very innovative, right? Right here, I think we are connecting different exciting dots. So yeah, if you look at, for example, John Kabat-Zinn, who's considered as like the godfather of mindfulness movement within the US, he defines that as paying attention in a specific way, on purpose and in the present moment and non-judgmentally, right? So I think to me, it's about just basically being aware. I get that definition and I like it. But I think for the purpose of our discussion, I want to build upon that to talk about resilience, right? It's really something I have to say I thought much more in this post-pandemic world, where many of us were just forced to think of everything one day at a time, one event at a time, right? Going back to what I was saying, we talked about curiosity. I think it's very intrinsic to an individual human mind. I mean, we know, right? Like a child knows how to be very curious. So yeah, it's very intrinsic to us. In that same way, I think when we talk about solving problems and making the world a little better, I think that thought is very intrinsic to the collective mind that is formed, through notions of different organizations, communities, nations. So this whole process of innovation, I think it's essentially just freeing that individual and the collective mind to be itself, right? And that's why I think it feels very liberating. It feels exciting and fun. Now, how do we do that though, when the world feels very uncertain because of, let's say, pandemic or whatever other forces might be at play? How do we enable that when the world appears very fearful and pulling you in the other direction or pulling you down? So in my mind, to nullify that, we need a certain level of resilience. And building that resilience is what mindfulness is all about for me. Yes. And it's totally easier said than done. And I'm not saying that I'm there at all. I feel vulnerable, but I think there is resilience building in owning that vulnerability, right? And just to wrap up this thought, I think if we aggregate all of this at an organizational level, which is sort of what we've been talking about, now we are thinking of organizational resilience. And there are, as we know, huge benefits of having that, so that you can improve your innovation ecosystem, your growth, and your organizational competitiveness, right? That to me, I think sums it up. And I know that we've been talking about mindfulness at a very philosophical and cognitive level, but I know that there is more to it to decipher from a purely biological level, right? And it also, I think that dynamics operates when it is about two different people working together, not just a big organization. Kuan, what are your thoughts about some of that?
So, Prachi, I loved what you were saying about organizational resilience and this connection to mindfulness, and now thinking about it from a more biological level. As I think about that, I've been doing a lot of research in emotional intelligence. So this was sort of in the 90s, the beginning of that discussion of mindfulness. And one of the scholars that started that research was Dr. Richard Boyastis, who is now at Case Western University. I heard him at a conference not too long ago talking about resonant leadership. And what he meant by resonant leadership was the idea that if we are not mindful and we walk into our organizations and we're under a lot of chronic stress, we subconsciously shut down our employees' and teams' ability to innovate because of that energy that we're putting out there. So this was very interesting to me. And the way he came about this is through brain scans. He actually worked with a neuroscientist, and they studied what happens to brains whenever people are under chronic stress and that they are not mindful. And they showed that the left side of the brain, which is responsible for open thought, innovation, creativity, that curiosity that you talked about, basically no blood starts to flow in that area because we go to fight or flight, right?
Right.
Because biologically, that's what we're our tendency, right? If we're under stress, we want to respond to the stress. And so that means we're going to tasks and lists and, what do we have to accomplish that day, as opposed to having that open thinking about what's the art of the possible, which is what we want in an innovative culture. So he looked at spec ops teams in particular, so special operations teams. And you would think, one might have an assumption that these teams are under a lot of stress. It turned out that this team was the most mindful of all of the groups of the brains that he scanned. And what that came down to was the instrumental intimacy that was formed as a result of all of the training that those teams had gone through together, and the idea that under any circumstances, regardless of what was going on in the external environment, they each had each other's back, and they trusted that each other knew exactly what to do under any circumstance that they could come across. So I know, Prachi, you and I have talked about this, a lot at work as we form teams together, right? It was so important for us to establish that kind of trust and intimacy, and the idea that no matter what, we would have each other's back. But we also know that in these corporate cultures or organizations, it's not always the case, right? That we don't always have that magical opportunity to create that kind of intimacy and to have that special circumstance where we have great leadership that's supporting us, right? We have a team that just knows how to function so well together, doing work that makes us all inspired and, excited to come to work the next day.
Right.
So the idea with this mindfulness topic is, how do we consciously try to create that kind of relationship in our organizations so that it can lead to that organizational resilience that can help a culture of innovation to thrive. Now that we've, defined it at a cognitive level, we've defined mindfulness at a biological level, let's think more practically, right? What are some techniques for bringing this mindfulness to work? Prachi, what ideas do you have?
Yeah. So I think, it's so important to talk about mindfulness at work. But I have to start off by saying that there is a bit of a contradiction right there, right? Because in some sense, because of COVID or whatever, the boundaries between work and non-work really blurred. But to me, it was a false division to begin with, right? So not only are there intersections between your work and your non-work spectrum, it's actually all integrated. I mean, to me, it's just life. And you are on a certain level of mindfulness depending on the situation that you are in. So my personal techniques, I'm a fan of the Headspace app. I use that here and there, and it really has all kinds of different exercises. I like that. Specifically at work, I like the concept of power poses. And it is essentially taking a specific power pose before a big event or a conference, or where you are maybe presenting to a large audience or whatever. And it really allows you to bring the focus back to what is going on here and now, right? So that's my, I think, sort of a second technique. And the third one, which I'm trying to use, is I like that because it's very catchy and easy to remember. It's name it to tame it, where if there is a particular emotion or situation, then it's better to actually articulate what that is, give it a name and put it out
Mm-hmm.
there. Right. And that's the way to start taming it. It's I love that thought there. What about you, Kuan?
So I liked where you started with this idea that it's sort of this false separation, when you
Mm-hmm.
talk about work-life balance and, the idea that maybe, what's happening at work? Are we not living at work? I like thinking about this idea that I think mindfulness as a concept is a lot more practice. It's a lot more well understood when we think about it in the context of our personal lives.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of we need to bridge this gap to bring that mindfulness practice into now our work life, because we absolutely spend so much time at work, and it should be more about integrating our work with our lives so that both sides can thrive. I've thought a lot about, this idea of bridging the gap, and,
Mm-hmm.
through these methodologies that we talk about, we bring up these ideas of trust and collaboration, but we need to get down to what can I do at a personal level. And I think it's not that dissimilar.
Mm-hmm.
The same things that we do in our personal lives, we need to do at work. And I think, it's a daily thing. It's not something, I think at work we tend to think about training, right? We can't go to
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness training and then it just happens. It has to be something that's a daily practice. I think I like your idea of apps. I know we've talked a little bit about how do we integrate those kinds of applications into maybe like a work collaboration platform
Mm-hmm.
like Zoom or Teams. Like, is there a way to say, hey, now's a good time for your team to get together and do some
Right.
mindfulness practices? And I know the Japanese, there's a lot of Asian cultures that have already done this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe there was a little bit more of a sense of urgency because Japanese culture tends to be a little bit more stressful. Typically they're very
Passionate about work
passionate
and so
about
very
work.
dedicated. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so they have already integrated, right,
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness practice in their organizations. And so I think the idea is to study some of these practices and see how we can make it palatable for Western companies and cultures.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's finding that right balance of what works for a particular culture, for a particular organization, right? And for a particular individual at their level. As we sort of, start wrapping up our dialogue here a little bit, Kuan, and, I'm looking all around. The holiday season is here. And for many, this provides a time for celebrations. But as we know, for many, it is also a time of feeling emotionally down and alone. In a perfect world, which has a better level and better sense of mindfulness, we would celebrate throughout, right? And we would be in tune with all of our positive, negative emotions throughout. As we march along with that thought, and given everything that we've discussed today, what is that one thing that you would do differently at work? And I would also encourage our listeners to think about that one simple thing and take that one simple step, right? So, Kuan?
So, what's really worked for me, I've started it a little bit, is the idea of daily meditation. Starting the day with pausing, right? Not going straight to my email, not going straight to my to do list, and doing something for pleasure, maybe reading or taking a walk or
Mm-hmm.
listening to a song that inspires me. And certainly that the idea of a power pose, I never thought about it that way, but just having that physical presence,
Mm-hmm.
like just realizing that that translates into how my day is going to go. And so yoga is certainly part of that too, stretching and just making sure that physically I'm prepared, right, to take on
Mm-hmm.
everything that's coming that day. So I think more of that, right? More of making sure that
Sure.
I'm starting the day with thinking about how to open up that left brain of mine.
Oh, all right. Love
Yeah.
that. And I'll say that, look, I think you and I can never come up with just one thing. We
No.
always have our long list, no matter what the topic, which is a problem. But, a topic for another day. But I think for me, I want to, not only read a little bit more about Zen Buddhism, that fascinates me quite a bit. So that's certainly on my list. But more immediately, I think I want to work on rewiring some more those thought structures, and specifically at work, by just asking two simple questions. How can I see this particular situation in a different way? Meaning, is there something that I'm missing, right? If there is anything. And what can I be grateful for in this particular situation? So just two simple questions. And, I just want to use that as a mechanism to essentially rewire the brain a little bit. So that's my thought.
Well, Prachi, thank you so much for talking to me today about this topic. I think there's so many different directions that we could potentially take this as we flesh out this idea of how to bring more mindfulness to work. And hopefully, as everybody's, going into their celebrations and their holidays, that you can take a little bit of this to help you with celebrating the year and thinking about the future and how we can do more collaboration and innovating together in 2022. So with that, thank you guys for listening, and see you next year.
We'll be back.
Thank you, Kuan and Prachi, for another great podcast on the intersections between a culture of innovation and mindfulness. I cannot wait for episode 4. Make sure you're following Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at UAHI2C. Bye guys, onward and upward.